Hi everyone! Depending on the era of music being considered, most of us are taught that so-called forbidden part writing procedures such as direct and hidden consecutives and second inversion or 6/4 chords must, in the case of consecutives, be avoided, and for 6/4 chords be handled in particular ways. While this is good advice, especially if we're trying to compose in the style of a particular era, it can sometimes create the impression that if these features are present in a work, they were overlooked by the composer or are a mistake. Rather than treating the presence of consecutives and 6/4 chords in this way, therefore, perhaps we should determine what it is about their use in a particular context that persuaded the composer to use them. It must be remembered, after all, that the composer would have been very aware of the consecutives or 6/4's presence and would have retained them for a specific reason or effect. It must be remembered also that composers weren't avoiding or limiting the use of consecutives and 6/4 chords because they were incorrect, but because of musical reasons. 6/4 chords were treated in particular ways because they sound unstable and are typically placed in locations such as offbeats or weak beats of a bar where they're not too prominent, or are treated essentially as a decoration of the following chord. Even cadential 6/4 chords, which are used on strong beats, essentially decorate the following dominant chord. Composers typically avoid direct and hidden consecutives because if two or more perfect unisons or octaves are used, both parts duplicate the other, thereby negating the individuality of both. With perfect fifths, because major and minor triads include this interval in their construction, the fifth interval strongly defines a triad and therefore provides harmonic stability. This stability, when used consecutively, works against the progress of the music. While in most cases we will never know a composer's exact thought process, we can often determine likely factors influencing their compositional decisions. And while I'm not promoting a lazy approach to composition, I do think we must acknowledge that sometimes composers were happy to use certain procedures, and the reasons they did so should be explored. Sometimes also the use of consecutives, or what have been termed by some later theorists as acceptable consecutives, was a stylistic feature of a composer's or musical era's sound. In the Baroque, for example, this type of texture is fairly common. Here, the texture includes a series of consecutive fifths, which Bach appears to be treating as a connection between first inversion and root position tonic G major harmony. In this context, perhaps, the consecutives were deemed acceptable as they're heard as an intervallic pattern moving as a series of thirds, with the fifths behaving as incomplete upper neighbour notes to the right-hand notes of the vertical thirds. In other words, the structural thirds are the important element in this passage, not the fifths. I'll say more about this in my video looking at the C major invention. Here then, while consecutives are present, and while in other contexts and musical eras composers avoided this type of usage, for Baroque composers this is an example of acceptable consecutives. In this example by Scarlatti, while octaves are present, they cannot be called consecutives as they don't occur between changes of harmony, but rather prolonged single chords. Here, D dominant 7th harmony is prolonged by this G passing note in the right hand, and the changing note figure consisting of the notes E and G. In this context, the E and G notes are non-harmony notes, and despite the G changing note forming an octave with the right hand G, which in turn moves on from the preceding F sharp octave to the A octave, the G of the changing note figure's motion is actually to the following F sharp. The two parts together then move as a series of thirds with intervening octaves, which are still present but acceptable within this texture. The octaves also result as a doubling by the eighth notes of the 16th note contour and are therefore not true octaves but a thickening of the line, moving from the root note to third degree of the underlying chord. Here, however, hidden fifths are present as they occur between tonic and subdominant chords, but are perhaps considered acceptable as the 16th note D is part of an established pattern alternating thirds and seconds, which then moves by step to C. The fifths also occur on the 8th note offbeat of a weak quarter note beat of the bar. As always, if you're attempting to compose in the style of a particular era, and especially if you are going to be graded on your efforts, you should try not to include anything deemed incorrect, as you probably won't be able to defend your usage. If, on the other hand, you're composing for yourself and you wish to include an acceptable consecutive or 6/4 chord, as long as there is a musical reason for its inclusion, then feel free to do so. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.